now I'd be happy to hear from you. It's an activist crowd. That's the Brecht Auditorium. So, and you should feel free to dissent. You can even call me a closet crypto quasi-Zionist. I could handle it. Yes.
Is a major flaw of the Goldstone's report? It didn't address the legality of the move itself.
The question that was asked is it a major flaw of the Goldstone report that it didn't address the question of whether or not Israel even had the right to attack Gaza? I would answer that in two ways. Number one, I did speak and communicate with John Dugard on that issue. Both Goldstone and Dugard, they're both very respected South African jurists. Goldstone chaired a commission during the apartheid era on police illegalities under the apartheid regime, which was considered an important commission, at least its conclusions. Dugard is considered the father of human rights legislation in South Africa. So they're both formidable legal minds. The Dugard report, for those of you who are interested, on the legal issues is much more interesting. He devotes around 30 pages just going through what's the difference between genocide, persecution, crimes against humanity. It's a very sophisticated report. Dugard said to me that he felt Goldstone made an error, that everyone knew that Israel's first line of defense was going to be it had the right to attack, and that he should not have limited his mandate strictly to how the conflict was conducted, but he should have expanded his mandate to include, was the attack itself justified? Dugard concluded that it wasn't justified. I think that Goldstone there was negligent in the report. In his subsequent commentary, he was terrible. He came under a lot of attack, and it was clear he was retreating on certain points. And if you read the commentaries, the debates, the interviews and everything, Goldstone started to say, of course Israel had the right to self-defense, of course Israel had the right to deflect the attacks from coming from Gaza. He was weak, you know. Never look for idols, because they're always disappointing.
You know about Richard Falk? Falk was about the report?
Falk was, I know Richard Falk very well. He was my thesis advisor. Advisor in quotation marks. Falk's commentary would have been more interesting if he had read the report. Yeah. Oh, I promised you, excuse me.
Yeah. Yes, you mentioned that Israeli human rights organizations spoke about torture before Western, or ones in this country did.
Yes.
And I heard recently from our common friend, Feroz Sidwa, that Jessica Montel had recently denied claims of torture, and she runs Beta Salam. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but if it is, I was wondering why you think that's the case, and just more generally how Israeli human rights organizations cover the Gaza massacre.
Okay. The main Israeli human rights organization is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. And it's been very excellent over the past 20 years. It started up roughly around 1990. Actually, right now, at this moment, literally, it's celebrating its 20th anniversary. It's clear that B'Tselem has gotten weaker in the last couple of years or so. B'Tselem wants to be in the Israeli mainstream. And as the mainstream shifts more and more to the right, it's saying things which are not defensible. Jessica Montel, the executive director made some statements after, in the Jerusalem Post and the Huffington Post. She had a couple of articles on what happened in Gaza and on the Goldstone report, and she made statements which cannot be supported. And they cannot be supported, I know for certain, because I engaged in a very lengthy correspondence with her. And I kept asking her, I would like to know the basis on which you make these claims. And she could not supply the information. Now, the statement she issued for the 20th anniversary of B'Tselem, she said that one of the successes of B'Tselem was they managed to get Israel to completely end torture of Palestinian detainees. It's factually incorrect. It is factually correct that the amount of torture significantly declined after the Israeli High Court ruling of 1999. That's correct. It has significantly declined. It is factually incorrect that they have succeeded in abolishing torture of Palestinian detainees. And in fact, during the Gaza massacre, one of the unique aspects of the Goldstone report, one of the chapters was devoted to the treatment of Palestinian detainees during the massacre. And it was really ghastly. It was really a sight to behold when you were reading those pages. They were having the Palestinians dig sand trenches around the Israeli tanks and put them in the detainees in the trenches to use them as human shields. And the women had to do their bodily movements with the men in the trenches. The men were forced to strip naked, not just in underwear, they were all forced to strip naked. It was horrible what they were doing. But there are pressures, Israeli society, for whatever it means, is, it's moved significantly to the right. During the Gaza massacre, the estimates are between 90 and 96% of Israelis supported it. And even the usual theater that they put on, the anguished Amos Oz and David Grossman and A.B. Yahushua with their elongated faces and their heavy hearts and their, tormented eyes. They didn't even bother to pull that routine during the Gaza massacre. They did it in the last week, you may recall, during Israel's destruction of Lebanon in 2006. The 3 days before it was over, when it was a huge international outcry, the three of them, the Three Stooges, came out and put on their little routine, the heavy heart routine. But they didn't even bother this time around. The only one who, in the Israeli newspapers, B. Michael, who was a very good columnist, he was fired. Gideon Levy was excellent, but he came under terrible attack. It was a very small number. So I think part of it is that B'Tselem wants to be part of the consensus, and the other part of it is it's just pure extortion. So some of you may have noticed today an article came out, NGO Watch, which is the hoodlum organization that Israel uses to target human rights organizations. They said they're starting now to go after B'Tselem's funding. And it went through how B'Tselem is being funded by the European governments. Just what they did, as some of you may recall, they did the same thing when Breaking the Silence, when that publication came out. They immediately started to attack the governments which were subsidizing it. And now they're attacking the European governments that are subsidizing B'Tselem. And those pressures are very difficult to resist. I can tell you that the membership of B'Tselem, the field workers, were enraged at what Jessica Montel did. and she subsequently revised their position, at least in the Arabic press. Yeah.
How do you assess the consensus in the United States? Because the Congress refused to discuss the Goldstone report. You were purged from your position. Odell was purged from the bar school. Where do you see the pressure points or the points of intervention here in the United States? Because it seems to me that Israel appears as this great power in the Middle East, but it really sort of all depends on U.S. subsidy. And how are we in the United States? What is the consensus here? And how can we, in this country, put the pressure on?
Well, I want to make several points. First of all, everyone should try to get their hands on the Amnesty. There were two excellent reports by Amnesty on what happened in Gaza. One of them is a large one. It was called Death and Destruction, 22 Days of Death and Destruction. It was probably the best of all the reports. But before that, they had a report calling for a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel and the Palestinians. Well, the Palestinians, it means nothing because with an arms embargo on firecrackers and Roman candles doesn't make much sense. But on Israel, it's quite significant. And one of the points that Amnesty made in that report, or it said, made three points. It said, number one, that the transfer of weapons to consistent violators of human rights is illegal under international law. Number two, the main weapons supplier for Israel is, of course, the United States. And transferring the weapons is not only illegal under international law, but it's illegal under domestic U.S. law. And number three, they were very, very blunt. They said the whole Gaza massacre was paid for with U.S. taxpayer money. That's what they said. I mean, they used that expression. U.S. taxpayer money made possible what happened in Gaza. So we, of course, should focus on the U.S. I'm not really a skeptic. I'm not pessimistic on what can be done in the United States. I could see, you could look into polls. There are 1,000 different ways I could illustrate to you that support for Israel is significantly declining in the United States. In the last two Israeli acts of vandalism, the 2006 war and then the Gaza massacre, under 50% of Americans supported it. It was about 46% supported what Israel did in Lebanon and then in Gaza. But it's clear, just from public speaking, on the college campus, frankly, I would much rather be making the Palestinian case than the Israeli case. It takes very little courage to make the Palestinian case on a college campus nowadays. It takes a lot of courage to make the Israeli case. First of all, nobody's even interested in the Israeli case. Even if they bring a high-profile person to a fairly large campus, maybe 70 people who show up, the Hillel faithful. But other than that, there's very few people who even bother to come. There was a time, when I would speak, it was just sheer pandemonium. It was a circus, I admit it, Maybe I was part of it, I don't know. But it was a circus. And then there was a time where there were the huge demonstrations. I went to Columbia. I think there were 800 police. I told the cops, it was in January, I said, Martin Luther King had this kind of police protection, he'd still be around today. It was crazy. And there were the leafleting and this, and the demonstrations, the vigils. Now, they don't even bother anymore. I spoke this past year. There wasn't a demonstration, a vigil. There wasn't even a leaflet anymore. We've lost a huge amount of ground, and the Israeli and U.S. Jewish publications are very clear about that they've lost the generation of young people. And then if you look at, for example, the liberal bloggers, and even in liberal bloggers like Matt Iglesias, Glenn Greenwald, and those folks, they were denouncing the Gaza massacre from day 2, literally. The only ones who really came out supporting were these octogenarians, people like septuagenarians and octogenarians, people like Mr. Dershowitz, Walzer, Michael Walzer, Norman Podhoretz. There really wasn't many people coming out in support of Israel. So I think politically the prospects are quite good. I think it requires 2 things. First of all, it does require a certain amount of patience, because I think the political level is the last to change. There was some movement in Congress. It wasn't great, but there were actually 36 or so dissents on the bill attacking Goldstone. I know it wasn't great, but it was something. I think our job is, if we really want to reach people, I agree with the Gandhi strategy. You have to see where the current moral, political consensus is, and then to try to get people to act on where the consensus already is, that people think it's wrong what Israel is doing. And I think part of our problem, speaking as part of a political movement, part of our problem is that we never like the consensus. Whenever a consensus forms, it's never radical enough. And so when a consensus is now formed, you can call it, for lack of a better term, you could call it the Goldstone consensus. Now that it's crystallized, people are saying, no, it's no good, Goldstone's a Zionist, he wants 2 states, this is no good, that's no good. We don't take advantage of our victories. The International Court of Justice advisory opinion was a huge victory. It was completely squandered. The human rights reports, up until Goldstone, they were completely ignored. I think people are learning now. It was really terrific. After the Goldstone report, I think people were very smart. When Olmert went to speak at the University of Chicago, they unfurled 2 banners, one on the balcony, one in English, one in Arabic, and each banner had 1 word on it. 1 word, that's it. Goldstone. That was smart. That was smart, because that's their weak point. But if you're going to focus on aspects of a conflict where there's no consensus or a weak consensus, then I don't think that's the way to make progress. I'll call you in a moment, but just, yes.
Yeah, I came in late, so you may have covered things that may not have heard. I don't know if anyone before I came in defended Israel. Right now it seems that it's just a one-way street. But I want to ask you a few things. You keep, and you know much more about these documents than I do, and you keep continually repeat the massacre. Does Goldstone call it a massacre?
Well, Goldstone does say that Israel used disproportionate force to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population of Gaza. So if you prefer if I call it a terroristic war than a massacre, I'll acquiesce, and henceforth I'll refer to it as the terroristic war.
But Goldstone doesn't use the word terroristic. I asked you a question.
I think I just said, let me repeat, maybe you didn't hear me.
Okay.
Goldstone said Israel used disproportionate force to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population.
Okay.
Now, in order to terrorize a civilian population, you have to use terroristic force. Otherwise, you can't terrorize them.
Okay. Now, does the Goldstone report also blame the other side?
Yes, as I pointed out before you came in.
Okay, okay. But,
We'll stop there.
Okay, what did you say before? I heard you at least for half an hour or 40 minutes. You have never said one word against the Palestinians. Okay? There was a story in today's New York Times. You can start shouting whatever you want. There's a story in today's New York Times. Did you read it? Hamas is going to walk with Gandhi, with Martin Luther King. How can you even mention Gandhi?
Excuse me, sit down.
Oh, shut up!
That wasn't a very Gandhi response.
Okay, I'm not going to leave. You want to force me out? Go ahead and do it. Go ahead and do it. You can't have such meetings. What do you want? You want to destroy Israel? What do you want to do? Destroy Israel? What's your goal?
We want the next question.
What's the end line?
Free Palestine! Free
No!
Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
I don't care if you're Jewish or not. There's nothing to do with it.
Get out, you
can be a
fanatic.
non-Jew and support Israel. And okay, the fact that there's a Jew. By the way, Holbert is the most left-wing government that ever. Hamas is going to walk with Gandhi, with Martin Luther King. How can you even mention Gandhi?
Excuse me, sit down.
Oh, shut up!
That wasn't a very Gandhi response.
Okay, I'm not going to leave. You want to force me out? Go ahead and do it. Go ahead and do it. You can't have such meetings. What do you want? You want to destroy Israel? What do you want to do? Destroy Israel? What's your goal?
We want the next question.
What's the end line?
Free Palestine! Free
No!
Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
I don't care if you're Jewish or not. There's nothing to do with it.
Get out, you
can be a
fanatic.
non-Jew and support Israel. And okay, the fact that there's a Jew. By the way, Holbert is the most left-wing government that ever existed. And they're the ones. Why is that so funny? Is he the most left-winger?
I think that's probably true.
Yes. Now, how many thousands of rockets must Israelis take from the Palestinians before they react? They do have the right to defend themselves. Yeah, the meeting has been going on. It's a one-sided meeting. Maybe there's someone who can defend Israel. Yeah, okay. Is there anybody in this audience who will defend Israel, not by shouting like I do? Stand up and defend Israel. That's very funny.
Yeah, okay.
I'm going to change the subject a little bit. I want to actually talk a little bit about, I have a slight disagreement with your analysis, and I wonder how you respond. You do emphasize that I agree with you on the consensus, that that's what we have to work on, that's what we have to build on. And the human rights consensus is crucial for our movement, something we have to build, something we have to work on. But I think that you might be overemphasizing it in terms of how a movement can grow and how a movement can act. And I think the boycott and the divestment and the sanction movement is a way to counteract. It's only way that will be people going into courts, and I think a mass movement, a movement on universities and a movement in the streets. And I think we're in the process of maybe building that. And I think that, well, I'm only questioning your emphasis on how we should act. And my opinion is, which I agree with everything you've said, but that this component of boycotting, divestment, and sanctions has to be and should be crucial to the development of our movement. And And the model, I think the model of South Africa actually is a good model. So I'm interested in just what you left out, maybe.
Well, on the issue of the boycott, divestments, and sanctions, my opinion is that it's not a question, from my point of view, it's not a question of whether in principle you agree with it or not. It's a question of practically what works.
Right.
And the aspects of the boycott, divestment, and sanction strategy, which focus on Israeli illegalities, boycotting companies which have investments in the occupied territories and the settlements, calling for an arms embargo on transfer of weapons to Israel. All of those aspects of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions policy, in my opinion, have quite good prospects for success because they're grounded in international law. Once you start venturing into areas where there doesn't exist that kind of legal moral consensus, the boycott, divestments, and sanctions proves to be a much weaker, or the prospects prove to be, in my opinion, much less auspicious. I would also say I don't think it's entirely clear that the right model is South Africa, because in the current international climate, the focus for trying to bring countries to account are human rights law and laws of war. That seems to be the focal strategy now. Not boycott, divestments, and sanctions, but international criminal court, international tribunals, holding Israel to account on the basis of universal jurisdiction, making Israelis fear traveling abroad because of the prospects of being prosecuted, and also one of the major outcomes of the Gaza massacre or Gaza terroristic attack, one of the major outcomes of it was that Israelis were seized with great fear that they won't be able to carry out another massacre in the near future. That international public opinion simply will not tolerate it. And there were many quite mainstream and insightful columnists who worried that the main fallout from what happened in Gaza is that Gaza may be for Israel the last throw of the dice, that it simply can't do again what it did. But that's all within the framework of the international human rights law and laws of war. It's not within the framework of BDS. I read some odd, strange columns where people within our movement were claiming Goldstone as a victory for BDS, but I really don't know from what planet that dropped. Yes?
Hi, first I want to make a comment and then I have actually two questions. First I just want to address the man over here who's defending Israel. I don't agree, but at the same time, he does have a right to voice his questions. And I just want to say that it's very interesting because I know what it feels like to be in the minority perspective, and it's very funny to see the tides turn the other way on this issue. And I want to say that if he doesn't have the chance to ask those questions and receive answers, he's not going to be able to learn anything on this issue. And I think it's really important to respect the opportunity for that dialogue. So I just wanted to bring that up. Oh, I completely agree with you. And like I said, I don't agree with this stance at all. But what I'm saying is that, you know, I know that when I'm speaking to somebody that does not agree with me on an issue, and especially with this issue. I'm Jewish, and I've been to the occupied. I went to the West Bank, I spent a month there, and I know speaking with members of my family and with other Jewish people that do still support Israel, that they can reach a point where they will open their minds, but you really have to have that patience. So it's very important to have that dialogue. So I just wanted to make that point. My two questions. First of all, I have to ask you, you've talked a lot about the Israeli reaction to the Goldstone report. You've not spoken about Mahmoud Abbas's reaction to the Goldstone report, and I wanted to know your opinions on why he responded in the way that he did. And obviously, there's a lot of Palestinians feel very betrayed by that. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, considering the fact that the Israeli population is moving so far to the right, and even that a human rights organization like B'Tselem is feeling pressured by that, a lot of what you spoke about tonight I've read in Haaretz, and I've been very impressed with the fact that they've been so outspoken and vocal and honest about this, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on how they are able to get away with this sort of reporting in such a right-wing, closed-off environment.
First of all, with your initial comment, I completely agree. There are grounds for raising the issue of whether there was mutual respect shown. But on the other hand, I do think we should feel confident that the facts are on our side, truth is on our side, justice is on our side, and that if we just very calmly and patiently go through the record, that we can win. It's not easy, but I think we should try to be as patient as possible. I was reading the last volume of Gandhi's works for 1947, and all of his hopes are just being destroyed. He thought that Indians were committed to nonviolence. 30 years he invested in it, and then the British are leaving, and India erupts into this vast, ghastly, intercommunal bloodletting. And tens of thousands are killing each other each day in the streets of India. And Mr. Gandhi is very adamant. He wants that Hindu-Muslim unity. And he goes from Hindu temple to Hindu temple. And he begins every prayer service. He begins with a passage from the Quran. And it's enraging the Hindu fundamentalists. How dare you, in a Hindu temple, to be reading passages from the Quran? And Gandhi would begin each prayer service by saying, is there anyone in this room who objects to me reading from the Quran? And the first few prayer services, 2 or 3 Hindu fanatics raise their hand. He says, if you object, okay, I'm just going to leave. And then after around a few weeks, he decides, well, that's not really fair to the rest of the people who've come. And he says, okay, if you object, then let's talk about it. And 2 or 3 people in the audience of thousands, literally thousands who came to hear him, he would just spend the whole night very patiently going through it with them, 8 and 10 hours, just going through with them why, and remember, Gandhi's already 78 years old, why it's right for him to be reading from the Quran in a Hindu prayer service. I read that, I'll tell you, my eyes were glued to each word on the page because I was trying to learn from it, because I know we have encounters like this, and how do you handle it? It's not just a question of believing in nonviolence, it's a question of trying to win, trying to achieve the victory that we're aiming towards. By the end of by the end of these meetings, it was actually It was the stuff out of a drama. They're killing each other in Calcutta. 10,000 people killed in 1 week in this intercommunal bloodletting. And finally Gandhi says he would come into the neighborhoods where the Muslims lived and we were trying to throw them out, ethnically cleanse them. And he would stay with them. And he finally said, if you don't stop, speaking to all of Calcutta, I'm going to starve myself to death. It's as simple as that. And he had so much moral force, he actually stopped. He achieved peace in Calcutta. And then he was wanted elsewhere, and the Muslims were asking, would you please go there, because there's going to be another bloodbath there. No, the Hindus were asking him to please go to this city, because there's a bloodbath there. And Gandhi said, I'll only go under one condition. And the condition is, you have to promise, if the bloodletting starts again, you're going to go right into the middle of it and get yourself killed. That's it. You have to say, I'm willing, I'm going to get myself killed. And these folks are saying, well, you know, Gandhi, that's kind of asking us a lot, to do a lot. He said, and I'm not going to leave. And then finally, at the end, they agreed. We'll get ourselves killed, and we'll do exactly what you say. So that's a counsel for patience and courage. And there's a lot to learn there, because I think he accomplished a lot in his person. As to your questions about the Goldstone report, it was never quite clear why the so-called Palestinian so-called authority tried to kill the Goldstone report. The first speculation was that Abbas, that the Israelis had actual tapes of Abbas urging the Israelis to destroy Gaza. That was a claim that was made. It seems not to be true. The second claim that was made was that the U.S. put pressure on him to kill the report in the Human Rights Council. According to sources which I consider to be very good, it's probably not true either. That Abbas is such an obedient slave that you don't even have to tell him what to do. He knows what to do without doing that. And then they moved, as you know, to kill it. There was a huge uproar among the Palestinians, and it was reversed. But I feel now it's being just killed in another way, because the Goldstone report is slowly moving away from center stage, and all the focus now is on whether the Palestinians will declare a state, and the forthcoming statement from the EU, what they're going to say regarding the declaration of the Palestinian state. Today, Haaretz published the current version of the EU statement, which is not bad. It calls for a Palestinian state in the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as the capital. It does explicitly say, I hope they keep that East Jerusalem as the capital in the final version. There's going to be huge pressure on the EU to remove it. I don't think they can, because that's been their consistent position every year in the UN. And again, Goldstone was quite good. In the report, it refers to East Jerusalem as part of Palestinian occupied territory. So that was another strong aspect of the Goldstone report. But the focus is again going to be on the so-called peace process, and it's going to move away from the Goldstone, and I think that's a disaster. It's not a disaster, it's just more of the same. Because what's going to happen? The Palestinians will declare a state, then the Israelis will declare that we're annexing the settlement blocks, and then the U.S. will come in and say, well, obviously, we need to negotiate. And we'll be right back where we started from. You know? It's the whole problem with the way the whole process is conceived. That you can resolve this issue by declarations and political and diplomatic maneuvering, rather than trying to mobilize people to effect change. And that was, again, one of the things I admired about Gandhi. When people would ask him, what do you think the British are going to do? What do you think the British are going to do? Gandhi used to answer, I don't care what the British are thinking. It's just totally irrelevant. It's not what they're thinking that's important. It's what we do that's important. If we get our act right, if we do the right thing, then they'll have to do what we want them to do. But you don't do politics by investing yourself in saviors. Even if it were true, for argument's sake, even if it were true that the EU and the US were tomorrow to give the Palestinians the state, what kind of state would it be? It would be a state run by a gang of thugs and hoodlums and torturers and murderers. Is that what you want? Is that what you struggled all these decades for? And that was another thing that was good about Gandhi. I don't want to replace the British with a bunch of Indian crooks. That's not what it's about. He said independence, he used to call it not Swaraj, which means independence, but Hind Swaraj, which means like full independence. He says, for me, full independence means empowering the ordinary people. If it's just going to be a bunch of Indians replacing the British, who needs it? And that's what would happen if you have a granting of it from above. So number one, I don't think it's going to happen that way. Number two, even if it were to happen that way, I don't think it's particularly desirable. So it'll be Mr. Dahlen who's in charge, rather than Mr. Netanyahu. Oh, either way, it's Netanyahu and the U.S. is in charge. But no, I don't really think that's what politics is about. And for those who think it's what it's about, I can only respectfully disagree. Many people invested a lot in Mr. Obama. I remember being here not so many months ago, where hopes were riding high in Obama. I listened to his speech last night. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak. I don't watch television. I can't listen to that stuff. But I turned it on for a few minutes. And I just kept asking myself, okay, how would Bush have put it differently? I'm an atheist of the old school, but as a resolute atheist, I believe that God helps those who help themselves. We have to get our act together, or else we'll get nothing in this world. In other words, the famous civil rights leader, Fannie Lou Hamer, she was a very religious person, and there was a famous scene of her in the church, and she said to the people sitting in the pew, she said, you can pray to God all you want, but unless you get up and do something, you're not going to get anything. And that's right. I want to sit around and wait for what the EU is going to give. The EU? Berlusconi? Sarkozy? That lunatic Merkel? Why would you want anything from them? Yeah.
What does Zionism play into the basic subject of the evening, if at all?
Personally, I don't think... I have a personal stake in Zionism. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the topic. So if I were to renounce it, I would be renouncing my degree. But having said that, I just don't think it's relevant. There's an easy easy way to say everything in ordinary language and everybody understands without having to use phrases like Zionism. You can use phrases like, do you or do you not believe in ethnic cleansing? Do you or do you not believe in discriminatory laws? Do you or do you not believe in a state which privileges one group of citizens over another? All of those are statements which any ordinary person can understand. It's part of the common sense of political or moral language. But when you ask, are you or are you not a Zionist, it doesn't mean anything. A Zionist includes everybody from Benjamin Netanyahu to Noam Chomsky, who says he's a Zionist and says he's been a Zionist since he was 6 years old. Some of us when we were 6 who were learning how to tie our shoes and how to zipper our pants. Professor Chomsky was staking out a position on Zionism. But it includes everyone that runs the gamut, from Chomsky to Netanyahu. It includes everyone who runs the gamut from Mr. Goldstone to, any of those lunatics in Israel and the United States. I don't think it means anything. I think house demolitions mean something to people. Do you or do you not believe that a state should blow up a person's home? People can understand that. Do you think it's right that Palestinians in the occupied territories are not allowed to go worship in Jerusalem? Americans can understand that. I think we should stick to a language which is not ideologically disfigured. And we should remember that our aim and our goal is not to prove how politically correct we are, or politically pure we are, or how much more radical we are than somebody else. Our aim and our goal should be to try to, as the late and sometimes lamented Mao Zedong used to say, to unite the many to defeat the few, and not unite the many in order to defeat us. I don't see any place. I don't see any necessity for it. I think you can say the same things in a language which everybody can understand.